Does the Minister think this is a wise use of public funds?
Well, I have to differ from the Honourable Lady. I fully support the continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. It has kept us safe all these years, and so for as long as there's a Conservative government, there will be a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, and it's a pity her party can't line up behind the men and women of our armed forces who are absolutely committed to that deterrent.
Number 2,
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to. That was well spun out, wasn't it? I'd like to answer number 2 and 18 together. Shortly, we will be publishing the quinquennial review into the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme and the independent review into government provision of welfare services for veterans. Between them, they will ensure that the scheme remains fit for purpose, identify areas for improvement, and enable us to better align support services. Crucially, we will continue to press ahead with the 40 million digital transformation of paper-based processes.
John Derby.
At the last defence orals, I stated that claims to Veterans UK compensation scheme have dropped and rejections have risen compared to a decade ago. The Minister responding said the departmental digital programme will address this. However, is the Minister also concerned with the structural issues with this scheme? I say this because even the independent reviewer has said the scheme's process is overly burdensome and even distressing for the claimant due to unreasonable timeframes and lack of transparency. I look forward to hearing the Minister's response.
Well, I'm very glad she's asked that question because, of course, there are 2 reviews currently underway, the quinquennial review and the review that is being launched jointly by the MOD and the Office for Veterans Affairs. I suspect strongly that those reviews will bring forward recommendations to improve processes. But all institutions, of course, have to change with time. This is no different. I'm very pleased to note that fewer claims now are going to appeal to tribunal, and I think that's some measure of success. And I do pay tribute to those who administer them, who work very hard indeed.
Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past year, the number of veterans claiming universal credit has increased by 50%. How does the Minister plan on helping veterans in receipt of universal credit acquire the skills that they need to access well-paid employment?
Well, universal credit is an in-work benefit. It will affect a small number of service people. He will know, of course, we've done everything we can to mitigate cost of living rises, costs. I've told in response to the previous question, freeze on accommodation costs, freeze on food, a contribution to offset increases in council tax. All of those things, I think, are helping our service personnel at this very difficult time. We'll continue to do what we can to mitigate those cost of living increases.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, one group of veterans to whom a gross injustice was done many years ago now were the LGBT community, who until the year 2001 were court-martialed, shamed and dismissed. And that shame is still with them until today. It hasn't yet been corrected. Now, the government perfectly properly commissioned a report by Lord Etherton to look into the whole matter, and I understand that it replied last week. Will the government now undertake to produce that report? Will they undertake to have an oral statement in this House to discuss it? And above all, will they accept both the apology, which it calls for, and the financial compensation, which they deserve?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for that. I suspect I should be asked the same question, Mr. Speaker, this Saturday when I attend London Pride. The Etherton report has been delivered. It is pretty magisterial, as you expect from Terence Etherton, with a number of recommendations which at the moment we are working through. When we respond, it'll be a proper response, and I hope will satisfy him.
And the Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you're going to be... sorry, the Minister's... the Minister will be pressed again for his response. He won't have to wait until Saturday. Because until 2000, it was illegal to be gay in the UK Armed Forces. The loss of livelihoods and long-term suffering endured by LGBT plus veterans as a result of this cruel and unjust policy has been immense. I'm pleased that there is such cross-party agreement about the publication of this report being so important to those who have experienced such injustice. So 18 months on, there is still no report yet and no government apology. So will the Minister confirm to the House specifically when the report will be published in full, with all testimony, and when we can expect an apology from the Prime Minister for this historic injustice.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady. It is this government that set up this review. 1967 to 2000 this was going on. It was an appalling stain on all of us. And I'm really pleased that this government at long last has gripped this. I'm afraid she's going to have to be a little bit more patient, but I suspect we will be publishing this report and a response very soon indeed.
Emma
3, please, Mr. Speaker.
The government has injected over £29 billion of additional funding into defence since 2020, investing in army modernisation, major platforms like the Type 26, Type 31, Challenger 3 and F-35, and restocking of ammunition in order to make sure that we reverse the hollowing out of our armed forces that has occurred under successive governments for the last 30 years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for that response. But only recently, the Deputy Secretary said Britain is just holding on to its status as one of NATO's leading organisations and that our army is too small. Former CDS said that all of our armed forces are too small, with the army having significant capability deficiencies. The government are failing our forces, aren't they?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, it was the party opposite that cut 19 battalions from the army when I was serving under her government. I would secondly say that what's very important, Mr. Speaker, is that the size of the army is not only important that it's the right size, but it is an army that is properly equipped and able to do its job. Having just numbers and non-equipment leads to a place where we ended up with snatched Land Rovers in Afghanistan under her government.
Select Committee Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I endorse the words of my Defence Select Committee colleague? But the Secretary of State himself used the words hollowing out of our armed forces. The head of the Army today said at the RUSI Land Warfare Conference that our world is heading back into the 1930s with growing threats. Would he agree that the Treasury's argument to increase defence spending to 2.5% when the economics improve is not only naive, but it's also illogical, because our economy and our national security are one and the same thing. We need to invest in our army and air force and navy now, not when the economy, Britain's economy, improves.
My right honourable friend makes an important point about the levels of defence spending. First of all, spend on the army is 20% higher since I have started as Defence Secretary, and I have made sure that a greater proportion of that spend is spent on catching up and modernising the armed forces that has been neglected all the way back to Afghanistan and Iraq, where we were spending money on UORs rather than the core budget to modernise that equipment. On his point about the Treasury has also accepted, as the Chancellor did from this dispatch box, that defence will require a greater share of public spending. Part of the big challenge is that we recognise that the culture has changed across government, that in Whitehall, defence requires and needs a greater proportion if it is to defend these shores and indeed our people. That is how it used to be. I'm confident the Prime Minister's support of 2.5% and indeed the Chancellor's position is a path in the right direction, and of course it couldn't be needed quicker.
We come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, the Defence Secretary admitted that his government have hollowed out and underfunded our armed forces. And in the last week, a string of senior military figures have agreed. NATO's second-in-command said the British Army is too small. A former Chief of the Defence Staff has said the Army is now too weak. And another ex-CDS has said the hollowing out of warfighting resilience within the armed forces has been the single most obvious shortfall since 2010. Will the Defence Secretary halt this hollowing out in his new Defence Command paper, and will this be published this month as he's promised?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, the right honourable gentleman comes to this House knowing full well that my statements on hollowing out are not about this government, it's about successive governments for the last 30 years. Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to look at that statement, because that statement verges on misleading the House, Mr. Speaker. It verges on it. He knows that is the fact. I have consistently pointed out that that is not the case, but he continues to use this in this House. The way we have started to reverse is an increase of £29 billion into the core funding of the armed forces. And whatever I have done with that new money, Mr. Speaker, I have made sure that it is there to properly equip all the people of the armed forces and properly support them. There is no point playing a numbers game when men and women could be sent to the front line without the right equipment. Yep. All we see from the party opposite is a numbers game without any money attached.
Yeah. John Healey.
Well, I have his exact words here, Mr. Speaker. It's January the 30th, column 18 of Hansard, and after inviting me to get Labour's shortcomings off my chest, he said, "I am happy to say that we have hollowed out and underfunded." Now, he boasts about being the longest-serving Tory Defence Secretary, but in 4 years, he's failed to halt this hollowing out, he's failed to fix the broken procurement system, he's failed to win fresh funding this year, even to cover inflation, and he's failed to stop service morale reaching record lows. Does he not see it as a national embarrassment for Britain to go to next month's NATO summit as one of only 5 NATO nations that has not rebooted defence plans since President Putin invaded Ukraine?
Okay. On that quote, Mr. Speaker, I said if he admits that Labour had hollowed it out under its term of office. How convenient to forget that the whole point is that in 30 years, the point was after the Cold War, successive governments pushed defence to the side and not to the centre. And when he talks about my record in defence, let's look at defence procurement, because he's fond of coming to the dispatch box about that. In 2009 under Labour, 15% of projects coming out of the armed forces were overpriced, overcost, and 28% of them, the average delay was 28%. It's now 4% are overcost and 15% of each project is delayed. We cut the bureaucracy in DNS from over 27,000 to 11,400. That's value for money, and at the same time, we've got a real increase in the defence budget, and we've injected £29 billion of additional funding.
Rebecca Longby.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
I know the Honourable Lady will welcome the commemorative nuclear test medal announced by the Prime Minister in November last year to recognise service veterans and civilian personnel who participated in the UK's atmospheric nuclear test programme between 1952 and 1967. The first nuclear test medals are expected to be available this autumn, I hope in time for Remembrance Sunday.
Rebecca Longby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard it all before. Governments come and go, but the nuclear veterans keep fighting. That's exactly what we did for our country all them years ago. So please, no more false promises, just action. Award us our medal. Those are the words of a nuclear testing veteran who speaks for the thousands promised medallic recognition by the Prime Minister on the 22nd of November last year. Yet they are now sadly informed that the medal has been delayed again by the government. So can I ask the Minister, what is the delay? Why is it happening? And can he categorically promise the House today that these veterans, whose average age is now 85, will finally be awarded their medals before Remembrance Sunday so that they and their descendants can proudly wear their medals?
Once again, I have to remind the Honourable Lady, it's this government that's got on and done this. The announcement was made on the 22nd of November last year, and I very much hope that by the 22nd of November this year, they will be getting their medals. It is my sincere hope that by Remembrance Sunday, they will be able to proudly wear what is due to them.
Jason McCall.
Question 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer questions 5 and 18 together. The UK continues to be recognised as a leading nation providing military support to Ukraine, training over 17,000 recruits and providing £2.3 billion of support last year and this year. We've sent hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery, ammunition, thousands of missiles and hundreds of armoured vehicles, and we've led the world on gifting of vital capabilities such as multiple launch rocket systems, Challenger 2 and Storm Shadow missiles.
Jason McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as contributing through the International Fund for Ukraine and the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, I really welcome that the UK has contributed an additional £60 million to NATO's comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which focuses on capacity building in key areas such as cyber and logistics. What is my right honourable friend's assessment of whether Ukraine is receiving the right kind of assistance from NATO to support their longer term ambitions for NATO membership?
NATO's comprehensive assistance package to Ukraine is providing urgent non-lethal assistance to enable the defence of Ukraine. The CAP also focuses on meeting Ukraine's longer-term needs, including reconstruction and transition to NATO standards, essential for countries wishing to join the alliance. Since February 2022, the UK has contributed £82 million to the CAP.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, in the past few days there have been deeply alarming reports in our press that the Russian forces may have placed highly destructive mines at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. What assessment has he made of the risk of a major nuclear incident?
My honourable friend asked a very important question about the risk posed by Russian activity, not only within his own borders, but obviously within Ukraine and the nuclear power station Zaporizhzhia. Of course, sadly, Russia is a country that's shown no restraint in using munitions against civilian structures, critical national infrastructure, hospitals, surgeries and other likes, and which adds to the long list of war crimes that they have clearly been engaged in. We monitor it very closely. We work with the international community to make sure that everything that can be done is done to protect that nuclear power station, and reminding not only through ourselves but through third countries Russia of its obligations to protect the people and the civilian population.
Christopher Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully support all the munitions that we've been able to provide to Ukraine, and I hope we'll be able to continue doing that for the foreseeable future, and certainly until Putin loses. But can I just ask him, it seems quite often that different countries, different allies of Ukraine are giving different kinds of bits and pieces of armament and munitions, and that doesn't necessarily add up to more than the sum of its parts. Wouldn't it be better if we now looked forward into the future by commissioning jointly so that we were getting more material at cost directly through to Ukraine?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a really important point. First of all, in order to better coordinate the gifting, we set up at the beginning the IDCC, the International Donor Coordination Cell, with about 80 British personnel in the lead of that alongside the United States, to make sure that what they were asking for is what they got, but also it was coordinated across the international community, because we all have different armories. But also in recognition of his very important point about how do we develop and encourage a sustainable supply chain to them. Britain, alongside Denmark, set up the International Fund. We've already committed £250 million last year and another £250 million this year. It's topping up towards €1 billion of funding plus, did specifically with one of the tasks to commission from effectively supply chains and manufacturing plants. So there's a long-term solution to their need to make sure that rolling off the production lines is that munition, because we all have finite stocks, and that's why we're going to use the cash in that fund to start commissioning, and we already have done.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Democrats are supportive of what the Secretary of State sets out in terms of the supply of arms and equipment to Ukraine for its sovereign defence. I wonder whether the Secretary of State has assessed what effect the Storm Shadow missile has had on operations, and also whether he could let us know whether other allies, such as the United States, also intend to provide long-range precision-guided missiles.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. The Storm Shadow missile has had a significant impact on the battlefield, is my understanding. Its accuracy and its ability to deliver successfully the payload as sent and designed by the Ukrainians has been almost without fault. And I think that is an extraordinary achievement of both of the engineering that went in it, but also of the Ukrainians to deploy it and use it as they need to. It has had an effect on the Russian army, mainly around its logistics and its command and control. It shows the importance of deep fires, and we absolutely would urge other international partners to come forward with their deep fires that are required. When HIMARS was put in the M270s, that has a range of 80 kilometres, that had a similar effect, and then the Russians moved many of their C2 nodes out of range, which is why deep fires became important. I think the key here is to recognise that if the Russians move out of range, we must work together internationally to make sure that the equipment is given to make sure they are back in range.
Mary Robinson.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 6 and 13 together. Last week, the Ministry of Defence published the Haythornthwaite Review into Armed Forces Incentivisation. Rick Haythornthwaite and his team have done an absolutely brilliant job. Defence is now working out how to implement the recommendations, But I think it's true to say that Haythornthwaite addresses our pressing need to build a firm foundation for an increasingly skills-based future in which defence will have to compete extremely hard if it is to continue to recruit and retain the very best.
Ray Robinson.
In February of last year, we were informed that the Ministry of Defence was actively considering recruiting people with neurodiversity. This will have given hope to many, including my constituent, who does not believe his autism diagnosis should be a barrier to service. Could my right honourable friend advise what is the status of these considerations, and would they look at running a pilot scheme so that neurodiverse individuals are encouraged to give their skills to the armed forces?
Well, look, we're really proud of the wide-ranging makeup of our armed forces, including many neurodiverse people currently. The Haythornthwaite Review recognised that tomorrow's defence will be very different to today's, and its people will be too. I agree with the thrust of my honourable friend's very perceptive question, and anticipate that the skills and attributes we will need in the future will mean casting the net much wider than before.
Len Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In North Devon, our two military bases, Chivenor and Arromanches, have units specialising in logistics, engineering and unmanned marine technologies. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to encourage more budding young engineers to fulfil their technical education and work prospects within our armed forces?
Look, the Ministry of Defence is deeply committed to supporting future engineers, both inside and outside the armed forces. The MOD is one of the largest deliverers of UK apprenticeships. We have 22,000 on 100 different apprenticeships at any one time. Furthermore, the Haythornthwaite Review and the Pan Defence Skills Framework will take skilling of our defence people to the next level.
Jim Shann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his response. When it comes to cybersecurity, Northern Ireland leads as one of the leading regions of the United Kingdom that are pushing that very, very hard. Does the Minister and has the Minister given any consideration to ensuring that companies that are involved in cybersecurity, we have many in Northern Ireland and south east of England here as well, could work in partnership with the MOD to ensure that those skills that have in private partnership are used in the Army?
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think one of the things we are going to see in the future is much more zigzagging between the armed forces and the industry. And back again, as it happens, so-called zigzag careers, and Haythornthwaite touches upon some of that. Going forward, I anticipate a much closer relationship, working relationship, between the armed forces and industry. We're all in it together.
So, Mr. Luke Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Armed Forces Day last week, as a nation, we thanked our armed forces for their service. And as a nation, we rightly invest in the skills of those who serve. But year after year, we are seeing more people with essential skills leaving the forces. Satisfaction with service life has plummeted from a recorded high of 61% under Labour in 2009 to 42% today. And, Mr. Speaker, it's even lower at 39% for junior ranks. So can the Minister tell the House what is his plan to restore morale, to help keep the skills we need in our armed forces? And by the time of the next general election, will morale in our forces be higher or lower than it is today?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. It's a great pleasure to see him in Falmouth for National Armed Forces Day at the weekend. The Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey was established in 2007 by the previous Labour government, and it's interesting to look back at what the figures were then. There was no Labour nirvana. We find from the figures in 2007 that the percentage saying morale is high is about the same or higher compared with 2007 as it is now. Well, he may chunter, but these are the facts. The percentage feeling valued has gone up significantly, as has the percentage who would recommend their career to a friend. Hardly surprising, things like satisfaction with kit is much better now than it was then. Remember 2007 with snatch Land Rovers, coffins on wheels. We remember, don't we, the absolutely appalling kit that the then Labour government provided to our armed forces in Iraq and then Afghanistan. I think the record Labour has is nothing to be proud of.
Tom Randall.
Question 7, sir.
I regularly engage with NATO allies, including most recently at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting on the 15th to 16th of June, where we demonstrated our continued solidarity with Ukraine and preparations for the upcoming Vilnius Leaders Summit, We lobbied hard and successfully for Finnish NATO membership, resulting in their historic accession, and we hope to achieve the same for Sweden before long.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the announcement at the NATO Defence Ministers' Conference that NATO has agreed a new UK-based maritime centre to support the security of undersea infrastructure. Can my right honourable friend assure me that this new centre is part of a long-term plan for the Alliance to secure better critical undersea infrastructure? And can he provide any further details on the role of this new unit?
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that NATO will host its new maritime centre for the security of critical undersea infrastructure in the UK. This centre is part of NATO's long-term plan to better secure our undersea infrastructure. Bringing together allies and industry, the centre will result in greater situational awareness and sharing of intelligence, expertise and innovation, and will also complement the latest Royal Navy ship, the RFA Proteus, whose job is to actually go out and monitor those critical supply lines and cyber cables.
Cavan Jones.
NATO was created to protect democracy and safeguard the values that underpin it. A year ago, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly passed a resolution under the presidency of Congressman Jerry Connolly to create a Democracy and Resilience Centre within NATO. I understand this has been agreed by all nations bar one. I wonder whether the Secretary of State at the upcoming summit can put some effort behind it, persuading that one member to agree to this initiative.
Well, what the best is for me is to write to the right honourable member about the details of that. I will look at it. I'm happy to discuss with him what he thinks needs to progress, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I was delighted to announce the War Widows ex gratia payment scheme last month. A specialist team is being stood up to deal with applications and assist and advise widows when the process opens. This will ensure that people are treated with the care they deserve and that their individual needs are met. The scheme will start as soon as possible and in any event by this autumn and will be open for 2 years. It won't erase their loss, but I hope this payment will offer some comfort to those affected. Can I again pay tribute to the staunch, dignified campaigning of the War Widows Association, which has brought us to this point, and also pay tribute to my right honourable friend who has been absolutely full square behind the campaign.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Well, in return, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank ministers for persevering with this in the face of many obstacles erected by the Treasury. There is just one last hurdle to surmount, and that is the question of taxation of the ex gratia payment. Given that the pensions, War Widows' pensions themselves, are a recognition of sacrifice and not a benefit, they are not taxed. If this ex gratia payment is taxed, some war widows will get only slightly more than half the lump sum concerned. Will he use his very best endeavours to avoid that unintended and unfortunate result of an otherwise successful initiative?
Yeah, I fully understand the point my right honourable friend is making. He will know that the payment was uplifted to take into account tax. I appreciate it may not be taking care of all tax in many, if not most, circumstances. What I will say to him, without setting any hairs running, is I'm having a conversation with colleagues, but I would emphasise it is around how we deal with tax on this payment, and I can't really give him any more comfort than that.
Question number 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOD works closely with UK industry and academia, including SMEs, to identify and invest in innovative technologies that address our most pressing capability challenges, as well as publishing our future priorities to incentivise investment. We are transforming processes to drive this at pace, and we are already testing and deploying these technologies.
Mr. Speaker, the integrated review said that AI would be used to strengthen defence capabilities. So in what ways are the armed forces using AI, and will he agree that weapon systems should always be subject to direct human control and never be allowed to operate autonomously?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend asked an excellent question, and I know there is huge public interest in the matter of AI. Just to be clear, so the Defence AI strategy last year set out our intent to develop and use artificial intelligence ambitiously, safely and responsibly. To be clear, we do not rule out incorporating AI within weapons systems, but we are clear that there must be context-appropriate human involvement in weapons which identify, select and attack targets. The UK does not possess fully autonomous weapon systems and has no intention of developing them. Finally, any weapons system used by the UK military would be governed by the MOD's robust framework of legal, safety and regulatory compliance regimes, irrespective of the technology involved.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, Morpheus is a next-generation £3 billion defence communication programme. It's meant to replace the Bowman kit on Ajax vehicles. Wow. It was originally set for introduction in 2025, but ministers have recently said a revised IOC is to be determined. Minister, when can we please have a statement on the state of play and the delivery of Morpheus?
Well, I'm going with the Honourable Gentleman. He asked an important question. This is an important programme. We are still committed to Morpheus, but there's a limit to what I can say at the moment because we are having contractual discussions with the supplier, but I hope I can say more in due course. As to Ajax, just to be absolutely clear, the intention is to upgrade the Bowman operating system within Ajax as the next step.
Leicester.
Question 11.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer this question together with question 16. We're driving the delivery of capability to the front line. Over a 2-year period to December 22, we have seen a 1-year reduction in the average programme duration, but we can do more to improve, and we are committed to learning the lessons of the Sheldon Review.
Bill Leicester.
On the 13th of March, the Defence Secretary told me that UK steel was not specified in defence procurement because, in his words, we do not manufacture the type of steel required. But according to UK steel producers, this isn't true, as they adjust production lines to match the needs of each contract. Now he knows that our steel producers can deliver. Will he do what all other major countries do for reasons of national security and guarantee to use domestically produced steel in defence procurement?
Well, I actually don't accept that. I mean, I'm happy to write to him with the details. Our position is, obviously, we want to use UK steel. We recognise its quality, but there will be cases where the appropriate steel has to be sourced from elsewhere, and obviously, ultimately, we have to deliver the equipment that is required for our capabilities.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say it's probably a bit of a shame that after he missed out on the Secretary of State, Secretary of NATO job, that the Secretary of State seems to have reverted to no more Mr. Nice Guy mode today. But it may improve as the day goes on. But can I ask the Minister in an amicable way, why, when following Ukraine, every major military industrial power is relentlessly focused on building domestic industrial capacity? Yep. Why is he stubbornly refusing to do the same? And his last answer on steel shows again the mindset hasn't changed. So why won't he back British industry and British military resilience?
Well, I'm happy to be Mr. Nice Guy when it comes to British industry. We're absolutely clear in DCIS. A central tenet of DCIS is that industrial capacity is a part of our defence capability. I'm absolutely clear about that. Of course, we want to have a strong domestic industry. There are occasions when acquisition has to be undertaken at pace, and we've seen in respect of Ukraine, getting the equipment out to them, we have had to be flexible in how we source that. But absolutely, we are committed to a strong industrial base for defence, both at SME level and with our primes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend look at how the MOD could support the UK's domestic supply chain by requiring prime contractors to adhere to a 30-day payment code for all defence suppliers, regardless of where they sit in the supply chain?
My honourable friend is a champion of SMEs, and he makes an excellent point about prompt payment. I can assure him that the MOD has a standard contract term that requires primes to pay suppliers within 30 days. I am informed this is called DEFCON 534, obviously not to be confused with other uses of the word DEFCON, but it's a very important point. Like him, I want to see our SME supported. He makes an excellent point.
Shadow Minister Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I asked the Minister for Defence Procurement during the statement on the Sheldon Review 2 weeks ago, he recognised the importance of workers to the defence industry. Now, we've already heard from my honourable friend from Blaenau Gwent about the problems of Morpheus, which I understand is now rated red by the MOD. The problem we had in Ajax are also emerging in Morpheus. And one of the things that came out of the Shelton review was that the company was not listening to the voices of workers on the shop floor. What guarantees is he putting in place to ensure workers have a reporting back system to ensure when things are going wrong, like with Ajax or potentially Morpheus, that these are reported and listened to and acted upon?
Well, I said in the statement that I recognised the unique angle he has on this, because of course he's constituency MP in respect of the factory in question. What I would stress is obviously the legal employment of those employees is responsibility of the company. We engage closely with them, and actually one of the lessons learned is about that close engagement at SRO level through DNS. I think Andy Start, CEO of DNS, Mr. Speaker, has led huge change there in improving the way we work together, and I am bound to say I suspect we will continue to build on the significant improvement the Secretary of State just highlighted in terms of both cost and timing between when they were last in power.
SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous Defence Procurement Minister impressed many with hitting the ground running. He developed a forensic grip on the manifold issues within this dysfunctional area of defence, and he worked up a plan to try and deal with that. Sadly, he moved on before he could implement that plan. So can I ask this latest Defence Procurement Minister if he has a plan, and what will be the first evidence of that plan that our weary service personnel and taxpayers might see?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his praise for my brilliant colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Cheltenham, who is now, of course, Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, no less. What I would say to him is absolutely we have a plan. Of course, that plan must take account of the lessons from the Shelton Review. I recognise in taking on this job there's been huge focus on Ajax, but I would just put it like this. The fact that Ajax is now with the Household Cavalry for regular field training, I hope, is a symbolic moment of showing we're turning the corner. We're going to engage right across defence to develop a better procurement system, and I want to ensure that delivers better outcomes, which is why I've also tasked the Permanent Secretary, as I said to the Select Committee, to undertake an end-to-end review of the whole defence operating model.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That response could have been loosely regarded as a kind of a stab at the previous question, but certainly not an attempt at answering mine. So let me try and probe a little further and give the Minister some examples which he may wish to bombast us with about his progress that he's making. How has he challenged the pedestrian progress towards the next phase of the new medium-lift helicopter tender? What is the delay with the Type 32 or Type 31 successor announcement? And why doesn't his element of defence procure ground-based anti-air missile systems to protect these islands in a more responsible way?
Well, he's ranged a long way there from air to ground. So I would just say that the key element here is to strengthen the speed and agility of our procurement, whatever the platform in question. Some of the platforms you refer to actually at the conceptual phase anyway. I'm committed, Mr. Speaker, to driving pace, because ultimately what this is about isn't just we don't want to have the delays we've seen in some notable programmes whilst noting that overall time is improving. Mr. Speaker, we need pace because that's how we maintain our competitive edge ultimately with our international adversaries.
This will be helpful as well. Matt Weston.
Number 12, please, sir.
The Ministry of Defence fully recognises the importance of safe, good quality and well-maintained homes. In the last 7 years, Defence has invested more than £936 million in service family accommodation. This includes £185 billion last year on modernising homes, tackling damp and mould and improving thermal efficiency. Currently, 97% of mod SFA meet or exceeds the government's decent home standards. Only these properties are allocated to service families. We strive to do better, Mr. Speaker, but for context, the figure for social housing is 91%.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will have noticed when he's been around various sites that just the substandard quality of the accommodation, indeed squalor in certain places. And the Minister will also know that there are some 800 armed forces families living in potentially unsafe homes that have not yet had gas safety checks. Can the Minister confirm what action he is taking in his government to make these homes safe?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to the for the question, Mr. Speaker. On gas and electric safety, my honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, was made aware of this issue on the 2nd of May, and He worked exceptionally quickly to remedy the issue. Currently, there are some 555 gas safety certificates outstanding. That number is plummeting dramatically, and I can tell him that they'll be cleared, almost all cleared, by the end of June. I think that's a measure of some success.
Mr. Speaker, if a private or professional landlord didn't properly complete these safety checks, they would be sued. It's completely unacceptable that we put armed forces personnel and their loved ones at risk 4 months because the FDIS contract that is meant to do this is completely broken. If the head of the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, who's meant to oversee this, is completely out of his depth, which some of us believe he is, after this, shouldn't he consider his position?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I think the important thing is that our honourable friend, the Minister, when he got to know about this, acted immediately to put the matter right. I'm not really interested in getting people's scalps. I'm interested in putting the matter right, and that's exactly what is happening.
Andrew Bridgen.
14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. The UK applied to the Permanent Structured Cooperation Military Mobility Project to help shape EU military transport procedures and infrastructure, addressing impediments to moving military personnel and assets across Europe at pace. We are negotiating the technical terms of our participation in the form of an administrative agreement, and we have reached agreement on the majority of the text.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, has given evidence to House committees on this issue, and he questioned why we were joining this and who had authorised it. He also stated that membership of these European Union defence structures are not an a la carte menu where the UK can choose what it wants and reject what it doesn't. It's very much a take it or leave it all or nothing situation. Does the Minister agree with Sir Richard's assessment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, conspiracy isn't as rife as the honourable gentleman seems to think. You can indeed choose which parts of PESCO you wish to be in, and the mobility project, which coordinates the development of infrastructure for the movement of NATO weapons and platforms across Europe, seems to be a pretty good thing on which the UK should seek to cooperate with the EU on.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has mentioned, the UK at the moment is considering acceding only to the military mobility element of PESCO. There are, however, over 60 separate elements. Can my right honourable friend indicate whether the government is considering joining any of those other elements?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we'll consider them on a case-by-case basis. Where there is merit and where it is in the UK interests to work with the European Union to the advantage of NATO and our own national interest, we will, of course, do so. But we won't do so blindly out of habit, only when it's in our interests.
Stop little Scott Benson.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as part of their summer campaign to reclaim illegally occupied territory, Ukraine has already recaptured approximately 300 square kilometres. That's more territory than Russia seized in its whole winter offensive. They continue to make gradual but steady tactical progress, undertaking major offensive operations on 3 main axes in the south and eastern Ukraine. In the Luhansk Oblast, Russian forces have made their own significant effort to launch an attack in the Sebryanka forest near Crimea. Russia has had some small gains, but Ukrainian forces have prevented a breakthrough. In Donetsk Oblast, Ukraine has gained impetus in its assaults around Bakhmut. In multiple brigade operations, Ukrainian forces have made progress on both the north and southern flanks of the town. Russia do not appear to have the uncommitted ground forces needed to counter the multiple threats it is now facing from Ukraine, which extends over 200 kilometres from the Bakhmut to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What discussions is the government having with other NATO members to ensure that every member of the alliance meets the 2% spending target?
I think as Vilnius approaches, Mr. Speaker, it's very, very important that we recommit and get other nations to recommit to make sure that 2% is viewed as a floor, not a ceiling. It's regretful that still only 7 to 8 nations in NATO are reaching that target. Britain is, of course, above the 2%. It's very important. Freedom is not free. You have to pay for it in the end.
Sir Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister told last week's Ukraine Recovery Conference we will maintain our support for Ukraine's defence and for the counter-offensive. With the developments in recent days, surely now's the time to accelerate, not just maintain, our military support for Ukraine.
Well, our support from Ukraine is made up of 2.3 billion. Not all of that is committed, and we continue to make sure that whatever Ukraine needs, we can try and give, and if we don't have it, whether we can use our network around the world to access it on their behalf. It's also important to make sure that we all focus on this offensive and give Ukraine what it needs for that offensive. The key test will be getting through all those defensive lines and to make sure that Russia is pushed back and is challenged from going into effectively a frozen conflict that Russia would, of course, like. I think it's important, though, to note it's easy for the comfort for all of us in London to say that. There are men and women of the Ukrainians going through minefields, through horrendous obstacle crossings, and facing an army that commits war crimes every single day.
Is the Secretary of State confident that Sweden's NATO membership application will be approved this year?
I think, Mr. Speaker, I'd say I'm optimistic. I had my phone call with my new Turkish counterpart last week. It was one of the first subjects I raised. I have also spoken consistently and on many occasions with Turkey and the leadership. I am confident that we will get there in the end. Sweden has made significant strides in its counter-terrorism legislation to deal with some of the issues that Turkey raised, and I think Turkey now recognises that as a strong effort.
Speller.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister give us a progress report on the contract for the Fleet Solid Support Ships? And given that 3 of these are equivalent to 2 aircraft carriers in size, can you confirm where's the steel coming from?
Well, he's very persistent, and I will have to check that point for him.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, I was recently invited to visit the Army Cadets in Arnold in my Gedling constituency and see the work they're doing and the skills they're learning from drill instruction to CPR. Now, I was never a cadet myself, but would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the work that Ben Mickle in Arnold and others across Nottinghamshire are doing in running cadet services, and would he encourage children and young people to take part?
Thank my honourable friend very much for that. I do congratulate Staff Sergeant Mickle and his fellow instructors. I think many of us were out and about for National Armed Forces Day on Saturday, Mr. Speaker, and saw some of our wonderful cadets, and I pay tribute to all those instructors who put in so many hours to make it all possible.
Well, Ribiradi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been asking the Prime Minister and other ministers about government bodies spying on the activities of British citizens, including politicians, activists and journalists. In a statement issued in 2020, the Ministry of Defence said that the British Army's information warfare unit, the 77th Brigade, do not and have never conducted any kind of action against British citizens. But then on the 30th of January this year, the Secretary of State said that the 77th Brigade scours Twitter to assess UK disinformation. So can the Minister clarify whether the 77th Brigade can conduct any surveillance actions against British citizens, for what purpose, and if this is really the best use of their time?
But, of course, a whole range of agencies, including 77 Brigade, will study media platforms that deliver social media to our citizens in this country, and where that comes from is obviously sometimes of a concern if it is from a foreign state trying to manipulate our young people. As a former security minister, I used to see the radicalisation, the exploitation, the sexual exploitation of people through those platforms, and I think we should all be grateful that we do monitor those systems.
Mr. Speaker, questions today have highlighted how important strong deterrence is at the moment, and accordingly, and I'm sure both people across the UK and my constituents will be taking a real keen interest in the outcomes of the NATO Leaders Summit in Vilnius in a couple of weeks. So I wondered if my right honourable friend could perhaps just outline what he believes or would consider to be positive outcomes for the UK defence at that summit.
The Right Honourable Lady asks a really important question about Vilnius. It is an important moment in NATO, obviously comes on the heels of war in Europe and the invasion of Ukraine. The Vilnius summit is important because it also is the transition from NATO, where allies will build on those commitments they made at Madrid summit and go further and faster to bolster Euro-Atlantic security. The UK remains committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. The most powerful deterrent is our commitment to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, backed up by modern, credible forces, and it continues to hold firm.
Colleague Sullivan.
With the conclusion of the events on Saturday in Russia being that Prigozhin has been relocated to Belarus and Russian tactical nuclear weapons also being relocated to Belarus, has the Secretary of State undertaken an assessment of the threat to Belarus, which is on the eastern flank of NATO and across much of the northern border of Ukraine, and will it form part of the discussions at the NATO summit in Vilnius?
The honourable gentleman raised an important point about the role of Belarus. First of all, we should recognise that so far in this legal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Belarus has simply supported through the use of its bases, but it itself has committed no forces, and the international community would very clearly warn Belarus that it should not do so and join Russia on this folly that it is engaged in. It is, of course, a deep concern when we see Russia trying to use Belarus as a sort of satellite state, or indeed a place to put its nuclear weapons. We keep that under constant review, and we make sure in the strongest possible terms Belarus is aware of the international concerns around its behaviour.
Sir Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The war in Ukraine will have given us some insight into Russia's war tactics. Now, the Defence Command White Paper will soon be published, I believe, and it'll be looking at investment decisions for the British Army and armed forces in general from the 2030s and beyond. What lessons have been learned from the war in Ukraine, and can you give us some insight into what sort of investment will be undertaken?
I can say to my right honourable friend that the Defence Command paper will be published before recess. I'm hoping it will be published sooner rather than later. It is currently in the position of write round to the rest of the government and make sure that we are recognising what's happened in Ukraine. One of the biggest lessons of Ukraine is whatever army you commit, you must make sure it is protected 360 degrees with air defence, electronic warfare, signals intelligence and the ability to reach at range. If you just do numbers, you end up...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of aircraft carriers, it seems that the Prince of Wales is the spare. Why is it the ministers are struggling to manage the repairs of this vital NATO flagship?
Well, it's an amusing way of putting the question, but actually it's a serious point. Our plans actually not been affected in operational terms, because it was always planned that Prince of Wales would return to flight trials this autumn, and that remains on schedule.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, to say to the Secretary of State, 40 years ago, Sir Galahad was struck during the course of the Falklands crisis, and many, many Welsh Guardsmen lost their lives and burnt to death. I've just attended a meeting of the widows and the children and some of the veterans. They've been desperate to get to the bottom of exactly why this happened, and they've been blocked through no releases. I had to beg my right honourable friend to allow us, some colleagues across the floor, to come and see him about the release of that information.
My right honourable friend might like to know that former colleagues of mine from the House of Division, from the Welsh Guards and others have also been in contact with me. I have asked to see the papers that have not been released. I'm not sure what powers I have to overrule decisions that were made earlier, but I think it is important for closure and for relatives to get to the bottom of their questions.
Mr. Stevens.
ACVC Hub, Community Veteran Support, Helping Heroes, three wonderful charities helping veterans in Glasgow South West. With veterans' mental health still an emerging field, can I ask ministers to consider providing a costed research and development plan to find innovative approaches to this vital research?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He'll be aware of the range of mental health support services that are open to our veterans, in particular Op Courage, and he will be interested to note Op Fortitude. Of course, there's always more we can do, particularly for those who have suffered as a result of their service. But I think it's important to say that in general, service in our armed forces is a positive for mental health and not a negative.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, given the events over the weekend, and I accept we've got the FCDO statement in due course, what MOD assessment has been made of Ukraine's ability to win in Ukraine?
The United Kingdom has always been confident that given the right international support, the right leadership and the right investment, Ukraine can defend its nation and see off this aggressive, illegal Russian invasion.
Drew Hendry.
The Armed Forces Attitude Survey results have just been published, and they showed that less than a third of personnel believe that their basic pay is adequate. Nearly a quarter are looking to leave the forces. Will the Secretary of State admit that it's high time he increased basic pay across the public service, but especially for those in uniform?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He'll be aware that the Armed Forces Pay Review Body has reported, and that will be released very shortly. Pay, of course, forms a part of a wider remuneration package, which includes an excellent non-contributory pension, subsidised accommodation, wraparound childcare, incremental pay, and a range of allowances. The non-financial aspects of the offer are also highly valued. What isn't highly valued, frankly, are the tax increases that the SNP put on in February, which makes servicemen in Scotland much worse off than they are in the rest of the United Kingdom.
Robert Ports. He's gone. Well, in which case, let's have Simon Jupp. He's a man on his feet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Marines charity based in East Devon helps provide support to former servicemen and women in Devon, who we celebrated on Saturday as part of Armed Forces Day. What assessment has my honourable friend made of the welfare provision for veterans in Devon?
Grateful to my honourable friend. I'm sorry I wasn't in Devon on Saturday. I was next door in Cornwall, commemorating our armed forces like he was. Of course, there are a range of welfare support services in Devon. He'll be aware of the regional welfare support operation that we have there with very expert welfare officers who can look after the needs of our wonderful veterans. Of course, we can always do more, but I would cite, as I just have done, Op Courage and now Op Fortitude, which I think will be of great assistance.
Owen Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, while we wait for the upcoming pay review, can I ask the Minister what assessment his department are making of terms of relative poverty amongst our service personnel? And while they await a significant and serious pay rise, what work are they doing with the Department for Work and Pensions to signpost colleagues to the benefits they're eligible for?
Here. Grateful to the honourable gentleman. He will be aware that in addition to pay, open to our armed forces is things like wraparound childcare, subsidised healthcare, subsidised dental care. He'll be aware of subsidised accommodation, freezing of food charges, help with council tax, things that we have done in these difficult times to take the edge off the cost of living crisis, and I hope he'll welcome that.
David Moore.
Mr. Speaker, nowhere does venting as well as my Southport constituency in this weekend's Armed Forces Day was truly testament to that fact. So would my right honourable friend support and certainly welcome an application from Southport to host the National Armed Forces Day in 2025?
Mr. Speaker, can I place on record our gratitude to Falmouth, Cornwall Council and Falmouth and all the organisers of the National Armed Forces Day this year, an extraordinary event laid on by that town, and I think it was a great tribute to the men and women of the armed forces and all those other local authorities who laid on an event up and down the country. Of course, I would welcome a bid from Southport. I'll also welcome bids from all over the country. I look forward to the fact this is becoming a growing competition to recognise our men and women of our armed forces.
Alan Morgan.
Mr. Speaker, on the 24th of October 2021, the former Minister wrote to my predecessor in this role and confirmed that a badly injured veteran in my constituency would receive adaptations to his home. Delays ensued, and last week I had a meeting with the DIO in which he declined to turn his camera on and said that it hadn't been signed off by a person with the right authority. Could the Minister confirm whether the former Minister had the authority, and will he honour it?
Sorry, the Honourable Lady is more than welcome to write to me with the details. We'll look into it as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've already heard, we were lucky enough to welcome the National Armed Forces family to Falmouth on Saturday for the National Armed Forces Day. From cadets to veterans and the air display and all the National Armed Forces personnel, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State whether he agrees with me in thanking everybody for their efforts that this was actually the best Armed Forces Day we've ever experienced.
Well, it's certainly the best MP for Falmouth, who's been very, very good at lobbying and making the case for Falmouth. And I'd certainly say Falmouth did an excellent event, but I'm not going to risk insulting all the previous nations who did a fantastic job as well.
Speaker, with MOD estate an outlier in allowing trail hunting on its land and tearing up of the MOU of hunt monitoring access determined personally by the Defence Secretary, will he confirm that his delayed statutory response on terminating the MOU will be answered, and will he instruct an independent review of hunting on MOD estate and the activities of the Royal Artillery Hunt, or has he something to hide?
Nothing to hide. To hunt on my department's land, an organisation must have a recognised governing body. All persons participating in a hunt must also be members of such an organisation. The organisation must also hold an MOD-issued licence. The terms which clearly state that only trail hunting carried out in accordance with the provisions of the Act are permitted. I withdrew the MOU that had never been announced to Parliament under her party's previous government, because the only people that should be masked and camouflaged on MOD land are soldiers in training and not hunt saboteurs.
Right, that completes questions.